speaker today is Dr. Antony Polonsky, who is the Albert Abramson Professor of Holocaust Studies, an appointment that is held jointly with Brandeis University and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He is the leading expert on Polish Jewish history and the editor of Pauline Studies in Polish Jewry. He's the author of a number of significant works on this subject and others, including the three-volume work, The Jews in Poland and Russia, which is, I assume, part of the subject on which he'll be speaking today. I want to remind folks that this is the reason this is called or yesterday's event was called the Backus Lecture, is because it honors Ozzy Backus, who is in many ways the founder of Russian or Soviet Slavic East European studies here at KU. And it was also a lecture that continues really to benefit from the generosity of the late teacher in history.
Well, thank you very much. As I said last night, it's a bittersweet moment to be here because I was hoping to see Anna, a very old and dear friend, and of course we all know that didn't happen. Ralph Waldo Emerson has said that all history is autobiography. So let me start by explaining how I came to write a three-volume history of the Jews in Poland and Russia. I first went to Poland in 1965 as a British Council exchange student to undertake research for my doctorate at the University of Oxford on the conflict between Józef Pilsudski and the Polish Parliament between 1926 and 1930. What brought me to the University of Warsaw to undertake this project? I didn't come from a Polish-speaking background. My mother's family were Russified Jews from Lithuania, and my father's Yiddish-speaking Jews from the area around Grodno. They both emigrated to South Africa at the end of the 19th century. I grew up in very comfortable conditions in post-war South Africa. I soon became aware of the deep racial divisions in that society and came to feel considerable guilt at my parents' lifestyle, dependent as it was on African servants, whom they, as representatives of the liberal section of the English-speaking minority, friends of Helen Suzman and supporters of the Progressive Party, treated with, as they thought, great benevolence, and in my eyes, with extreme paternalism. In the late 1950s, when I attended the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, the main political division was between the liberals and the Marxist-Leninists. Those, like myself, who adhered to the latter group, did so in rejection of the paternalism which we identified with our parents. Liberalism, in our view, was merely a form of sympathy for Africans in their difficult plight, whereas we had aligned ourselves with the iron laws of history identified by Marx and Engels. These clearly demonstrated, we believed, that the conflict in South Africa was not racial, as was obvious to everybody, except ourselves, but one of class, in which we, mostly young Jews and Indians, could find our natural place in the struggle of the local proletariat, along with that of the whole world, for the socialist millennium. These were still my views when I went to study at Oxford in the early 1960s. Coming from what we saw as a fascist country, when I began to look for a subject for my doctoral dissertation, I wished to study the phenomenon of right radicalism and fascism. I believed, wrongly, that all the interesting topics in the history of German National Socialism had already been investigated, and was drawn to analyze what I thought were similar manifestations in Poland. As one who, in spite of my Marxist beliefs, rejected the rigid discipline and bureaucratic character of the Communist Party of South Africa, I was attracted to what I thought was Władysław Gomulka's independent Polish road to socialism. And I was also greatly impressed by the films of Andrzej Wajda, above all, Generation and Ashes and Diamonds, which incidentally were shown in South Africa in the late 1950s and early 1960s, in spite of its fascist character, or perhaps because of it. I accepted that in a socialist country like Poland, there was an inevitable price to be paid in the form of the loss of freedom. But I believe that this only affected the intelligentsia, which was, in any case, hostile to socialism, and that this loss of freedom was compensated for by the higher rate of economic growth compared to the capitalist West, and the greater degree of social justice and equality. I was quickly disillusion. It became apparent to me that the loss of freedom affected the whole of the society, and that it was more far-reaching than in my native country, and that it made impossible serious and open discussion of the problems that Poland needed to face in the period of what was then described as the Little Stabilization. The economic system, with its shortages and distortions, was clearly much less efficient than that of the West, while Milovan had clearly been correct when he identified the emergence of a new privileged class under socialism. Under these circumstances, I was greatly impressed by the socialist critique of the regime for allegedly betraying the interests of the workers, circulated in 1965 by two young members, one of them a lecturer at Warsaw University, Jacek Kuron and Karol Modzelewski, for which they were imprisoned in July 1965 at the end of our first stay in Warsaw. I now began to write critically of Stalin's policy towards Poland during the Second World War and of the establishment and character of the communist system established in Poland after July 1944. I still believed that the communist system could be reformed from within. The years 1967-68 marked my final disillusionment. I was alarmed that the Soviet Union and its allies could pursue policies which seemed aimed at the destruction of the State of Israel, for which I discovered, again to my surprise, I felt some considerable concern, was disgusted that a faction of the Polish United Workers' Party could use crude anti-Semitic slogans in a bid for power and to discredit student calls for democratization, and strongly identified with those calls and for Alexander Dubček's attempt to establish communism with a human face in Czechoslovakia. It was particularly painful to me that the African National Congress, which was then, of course, dominated by the Communist Party of South Africa, and the Communist Party of South Africa issued a statement in early 1968 welcoming the fraternal intervention of the countries of the Warsaw Pact in Czechoslovakia. I now strongly identified with the developing opposition movement in Poland, with the Committee for the Defense of the Workers, and with the Solidarity movement. Like most Poles, I was shocked and surprised by the relative ease with which martial law was established. I shouldn't have been. The other side had an army, which of course we did not. A number of my friends believed that one of the reasons for the defeat of the First Solidarity had been its failure to make a proper reckoning with the chauvinistic and anti-Semitic currents in Polish life. And they encouraged me to seek contacts within the Jewish world to alleviate the obvious gap between Poles and Jews, insofar as these are separate and discrete groups, which of course is not always the case. They were right to point to the bitter feelings harbored on both sides of this divide. I participated in a series of academic conferences in the 1980s, which attempted to bridge this divide, and also became the chief editor of the yearbook Poland Studies in Polish Jewry, which attempted to encourage research on an interdisciplinary basis and from a wide variety of viewpoints. In the last 30 years, particularly since the negotiated end of communism in Poland, 1989, an enormous amount of research has been undertaken on all aspects of the Polish and Polish Jewish past. Historical study seems to oscillate between detailed investigation and attempts at providing a synthesis of existing knowledge. I became convinced that what was necessary was a synthesis of the new research undertaken not by a committee, as was the case with the Livo Encyclopedia of Jews in Eastern Europe, or by a group of scholars, as was the case with the Hebrew two-volume History of Jews in Poland, Kiev Resheva, but undertaken by a single author. And rashly, I decided to undertake this task myself. It was clear to me that the history of the Jews of the former Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is an important topic of study, because it is from these lands that the majority of world Jewry, whether in the State of Israel or in the diaspora, trace their roots. The Jewish past in these lands is well established in Jewish collective memory. With the opening of the archives in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and the vast amount of research which took place in the previous 30 years, it seemed to me that the time was ripe to produce a new synthetic account which would correct, on the one hand, the overly sentimental, and on the other, the excessively negative of this view of this past, both of which are widely held, sometimes simultaneously, although it's clearly illogical. I explained what I was attempting to do in the introduction to the first of the 3 volumes of the book, which I decided to call, in homage to the great Russian Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, The Jews in Poland and Russia. Chaim Nachman Bialik, the Hebrew poet, in a letter written in early January 1906 to the Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem, observed, "No country is better for the Jews than Russia." He was entitled to think so, although when you read this sentence to a non-scholarly Jewish audience, there are gasps, because in the 130 years prior to his letter, Hasidism had developed within the Tsarist Empire as a major religious revival. Its Misnagdic opponents had created the great Lithuanian yeshivot, Hebrew and Yiddish literature had flourished, and new political movements, above all Zionism and Jewish socialism, had emerged and transformed the Jewish political landscape. However, within a decade, the Bolshevik Revolution took place, and Stalin's subsequent seizure of power destroyed the basis of organized Jewish life in Russia and its empire until the collapse of the Soviet Union. In his introduction to the collective history, The Jews in Reborn Poland, Życie w Polsce odrodzone, published in 1932 and 1933, Ozia Szturm, the rabbi of the temple, the modern synagogue in Krakow, and chairman of the Jewish Parliamentary Club in the Polish Parliament, wrote, "What is the role of Polish Jewry today? What is its mission?" He continued, "Both qualitatively and quantitatively, its mission, which it will soon take up, is to assume the leadership of world Jewry. This was a task which he believed it alone was capable of undertaking, given the spiritual and material devastation of Soviet Jewry and the lack of freedom in which it lived, and the loss by American Jewry under the pressure of assimilation of its specific Jewish character. Polish Jewry," he said, "possessed the genuine character of Russian Jewry, but also lived in the freedom enjoyed by American Jews. He foresaw a splendid future for the Jews of Poland." I quote. Polish Jews in the past have on occasion determined the character of world Jewry. There were moments when the genius of the Jewish people reached its full flowering in Poland. I am convinced that events are again creating a situation in which in Poland there will emerge one of the great centers of the Jewish spirit. Yet within 7 years, Poland ceased to exist. Partition between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and the destruction of its large Jewish community was about to commence. These passages illustrate the basic themes I've examined in my book. In the first place, the enormous importance of the history of the Jews of Poland and Russia in the history of the Jewish people and the development of Jewish religious traditions. That the Jews of this area would come to assume such significance within world Jewry was by no means self-evident. During the 19th century, Germany was seen as the pattern for successful Jewish modernization. And many German Jews, like Heinrich Gretz, the first major historian of the Jewish people, who himself came from the lands of former Poland-Lithuania, frequently referred to the demoralized and barbarous state of the Jews here. Even in the 20th century, the Jews of the area was often seen in the Fiddler on the Roof syndrome as the repository of an unchanging and eternal Jewish authenticity, in spite of the multifaceted Jewish civilization which had developed here. Secondly, these passages illustrate the danger of reading history backwards. It's difficult to write the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe today without being aware of the devastating impact on their lives of 20th century integral nationalism, Nazism, and communism. Yet Bialik, writing at the time of the pogroms which accompanied the 1905 revolution, and on the eve of the cataclysms of the First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution, could still envisage a future of enormous promise for his community. So too did Thorn in the face of rising Polish nationalism and the threat of Hitler's coming to power in Germany. Bialik and Thorn thought of Polish and Russian Jews as separate entities, and certainly this was one of the consequences of the developments of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet in the middle of the 18th century, there was a strong sense of the common character of all Jews who lived in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What I've tried to do in the book is both to describe this common character along with the regional differences which existed in Poland and Lithuania, and then to outline how the impact of the partitions of the Commonwealth led to very different developments under Prussian Austrian, and Russian rule. This is a unusual situation for a historian. We don't have laboratory conditions. But here we have a situation where a similar group of people is subjected to very different policies, and not surprisingly, the results are very different. Similarly, I tried to analyze in Volume 3 the impact on Jewish life after the First World War of the emergence of the national states of Poland and Lithuania and the establishment of Bolshevik power in most of the former Tsarist Empire. The book's divided into 7 sections, and you can see the same pattern in the one-volume abridgment. The first deals with Jewish life in pre-modern Poland and Lithuania, starting with the establishment of a viable, though still very small, community in the early 14th century, and ending with the beginnings of the impact of modernity on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the mid-18th century. I'm sure everybody will have already noticed that I am a positivist historian. I glory in our links with Ranke, and I do believe in such things as pre-modernity and modernity, something which most of my students no longer seem to accept. Nevertheless, go back to the early period of section 1. A fundamental transformation of the geography of the Jewish world took place between 1200 and 1550, as a result of which Poland-Lithuania became the country with the largest Jewish population in the world. The situation, the number of Jews increased from about 25,000 in 1500 to perhaps 150,000 in the middle of the 17th century, and nearly 750,000 by 1750. The situation of the Jews here, as everywhere in Western Christendom, had a dual and paradoxical character. On the one hand, the Jews were a pariah group, espousing a religion which was rejected as both false and harmful by the dominant Roman Catholic Church. The supersessionist claims of Christianity had been set out by St. Paul, and the essence of the position of the Church was formulated by St. Augustine in the 5th century. This held that the Jews were to be tolerated in an inferior position in order to demonstrate the truths of Christianity. At the same time, the Jews enjoyed wide communal autonomy, both at the local and at the national level, and in some ways their situation resembled that of the other self-governing estates, above all the nobility, the burghers, and the church, into which Poland and Lithuania, like all the states of Western Christendom, were divided. They had been invited into Poland by the Polish kings to perform certain necessary functions, but like minting, banking, and foreign trade. From the mid-16th century, with the increasing political and social dominance of the nobility, the Szlachta, which owed its prosperity to the trade in grain down the Vistula and other rivers to the Baltic, Jews came to settle in the small towns which the nobles established. A marriage of convenience, as Moshe Rossman has described it, developed between the Jews and their noble protectors, for whom they worked as traders, estate administrators, and artisans. The second section begins in the middle of the 18th century, when, under the influence of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, many rulers began to initiate attempts, carried still further by their constitutional successors in the 19th century, to transform the Jews from members of a religious and cultural community into, in quotation marks, useful subjects, or, where a civil society had been established, into citizens. Jewish responses differed in the different parts of Europe. In Western Europe, the Jewish population was small and constitutional government was soon established. The economic transformation of society proceeded rapidly, leading to the emergence of an industrial society and strengthening the position of the liberal middle class. There the Jews were soon emancipated and integrated into this middle class, first politically and then more slowly and incompletely socially. Great careers were made in politics by people like Benjamin Disraeli and Adolphe Crémieux, and in economics by the Rothschilds and the Ephrussis. In Central Europe, the Jewish communities were larger. Constitutional government became established more slowly, and the Industrial Revolution only got underway in the 1850s. Jewish emancipation was also slower and was only completed in the Habsburg Empire in 1868 and in the newly unified German Empire in 1870. The process was accompanied by considerable opposition, and the Jewish leadership felt the need to justify their being granted civil rights. This desire to demonstrate their fitness for emancipation led to the emergence of new forms of Jewish religious life, which became, in America, the Reform and Conservative movements. However, although the Jews achieved full political equality, social integration remained elusive. The bourgeoisie remained divided, certainly until the late 19th century, with Jews at least predominating in its commercial and financial sections, while what was described as the Bildungsbürgertum, which provided the civil servants, teachers, and university professors, remained exclusively Christian. In the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this process was even more difficult and protracted. It led ultimately to the granting of full legal equality to the Jews in the Kingdom of Poland, a small statelet established in 1815 and in dynastic union with the Tsarist Empire in 1862, that's when they got civil rights, in Prussian Poland in 1869, 1870, and in Galicia, Austrian Poland in 1868. In the rest of the Tsarist Empire, which after 1815 had the largest concentration of Jews in the world, full legal equality for the Jews was not granted before the Revolution of February 1917. Although, particularly during the reign of Alexander II, attempts were made at the selective integration of some sections of the Jewish community. Only in Prussian Poland were Jews successfully integrated. But here, because their rights were granted by the Prussian government, they became Germans rather than Poles of the Jewish faith, something which became increasingly problematic, particularly for them, as the conflict between the Polish majority in the province and the German minority became more acute. In Galicia and the Kingdom of Poland, only a small minority of Jews adopted the Polish language and culture, while in the rest of the Tsarist Empire, the percentage of Russified Jews also remained small. A new period began with the pogrom wave of 1881 in the Tsarist Empire, which, though on a much smaller scale than those of 1903 to 6 and 1917 to 21, was a great shock to the Jewish community there. More important, the Tsarist government interpreted this pogrom wave as the result of the Jewish oppression of the recently freed peasantry. In fact, as everybody knows, it was the conditions of that emancipation which caused the crisis in the countryside. A few Jews, like the Brodskys or the Efrusis, made a fortune producing sugar, or the Efrusis, who became wealthy exporting grain, had indeed become rich. But the majority of Jews were in fact impoverished by the commercialization of agriculture and the loss of their traditional position of intermediaries between the landlords and their serfs. As a result of the pogrom wave, the Tsarist government now, for the most part, there are some exceptions to this and one shouldn't categorize this completely, abandoned attempts to transform the Jews into useful subjects and concentrated on limiting what they saw as the harmful impact of Jewish activity on the situation of the peasantry. This further worsened the economic situation of the Jews and led to a massive wave of immigration. By 1914, nearly 2 million Jews had immigrated from the Tsarist Empire and more than 500,000 from the Habsburg monarchy. In addition, the abandonment by the Tsarist government of its attempts at forced integration of the Jews created a major crisis for the previously dominant integrationist leadership of Russian Jewry. This group, based largely in St. Petersburg, was now challenged on two fronts. On the one hand, there were those who argued that the Jews were not a religious group who could be incorporated into the surrounding societies under the right political and social conditions, but a proto-national element like the emerging Lithuanian, Ukrainian, and indeed modern Polish nation. They should seek a national homeland, either in the historic heartland of the Jews in the Middle East or elsewhere, or alternatively a non-territorial form of national autonomy in the Tsarist and Habsburg empires. On the other hand, Jews also now began to support the burgeoning socialist movements. They did so for a number of reasons. Socialism seemed to be in harmony with traditional Jewish messianic aspirations. It appealed to the growing impoverished elements in Jewish society, and it also offered a better promise of integration. In the view of the socialists, anti-Semitism was incited by the capitalists to preserve their rule. Once capitalism had been abolished, or at least substantially transformed, the barriers to Jewish integration would fall. These new movements now spread from the Pale of Settlement to the Kingdom of Poland and Galicia, and even to Prussian Poland. What has been described as the new Jewish politics stimulated a huge outpouring of energy within the Jewish world. It brought about the modernization of both Hebrew and Yiddish, and the emergence of a flourishing secular literature and cultural life in both languages. It paved the way for the development of the Zionist movement and the ultimate establishment of a Jewish state. However, these achievements were bought at a high price. What the Jews were now demanding was no longer the equality of individuals before the law, but rather cultural autonomy for a non-territorial national group. This goal was going to prove much more difficult to achieve, and indeed one cannot really find too many places outside Switzerland, or maybe Belgium, where it has in fact been, Canada perhaps, been achieved. The last 4 sections deal with the history of Jews in Eastern Europe since 1914. In the short 20th century, between the outbreak of the First World War and the collapse of communism in Europe, this history has been tragic. In 1914, 2/3 of the world's Jews lived in this area. Today, 80% live either in the United States or in Israel, and the communities of Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus are small and declining. The decline is traced in Volume 3, and also in the last 7 chapters of the one volume, which concentrates essentially on the 20th century, which is in a way my principal field of interest. It was the result of local integral nationalism, the devastating impact of the genocidal policies of Nazi Germany, and the longer-term destructive effects of communist rule, particularly in its Stalinist incarnation. A number of contradictory processes may be observed in the evolution of Jewish life in Eastern Europe since 1914. In these years, a group of major Polish Jewish and Russian Jewish writers emerged, writing both in the Jewish languages and in those of the larger society. Polish literature in the 20th century cannot be understood without taking into account the works of writers like Bolesław Leśnian, Julian Tuwim, Antony Polonsky, and Bruno Schulz. Of the 4 Russian language writers who've received the Nobel Prize for Literature, 2, Boris Pasternak and Josip Brodsky, were of Jewish origin. How Jewish they remained, you can spend a lot of time discussing, which I will resist the temptation to engage in. And Osip Mandelstam and Isaac Babel, though their lives were cut short, are also writers of world stature. The Polish Jewish and Russian Jewish symbiosis, comparable to similar phenomena in the German-speaking lands and in the United States, was however limited by the failure of Jewish integration. The hope that the newly independent states of Poland and Lithuania would prove democratic and pluralistic and would find an appropriate place for their Jewish minorities were dashed. By the 1930s, both states had become increasingly authoritarian, while the attraction of fascist ideas and of radical solutions to the Jewish problem grew, particularly among young zealots. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the situation of the Jews in both of these countries had become desperate. In the Soviet Union, the optimism created by the revolution had by the late 1930s largely evaporated. Little was left of the system of Jewish autonomy created after 1921 by the Jewish sections of the Communist Party. Stalin's growing emphasis on the importance of the Russian people and of Russian nationalism to his regime made increasingly perilous the situation of Jews in the Soviet political apparatus and of the much larger group who had become Russified since 1917. This brings us to the Holocaust. I've no time, obviously, to discuss in detail the tragic destruction of the large majority of the Jews of the region. I should like, however, to make 2 points. The first is that the adoption, planning and implementation of a policy of mass murder of the Jews here was the work of the Nazi leadership and of the German people who for the most part willingly or unwillingly followed their lead. At the same time, the Nazis gave considerable incentives, both political and material, to those who participated in this genocide, and brutally punished, sometimes by death, those who attempted to assist their Jewish neighbors. I've attempted in my treatment of this issue to compare the responses of the different national groups in Eastern Europe to the anti-Jewish genocide, the Poles, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. Second point, which it's important to stress, is that these groups, unlike the Jews, for the most part saw themselves as fighting 2 occupying forces during the Second World War, the Nazis and the Soviets, and we can see in Ukraine today how this still plays out in politics. For the Jews, in spite of the reservations of many Jews at Soviet policies, the Soviets gave the opportunity to survive, and the Jews therefore had no choice but to support them. The end of the Second World War saw the whole area under Soviet control. Lithuania was now again annexed by the Soviet Union, and in Poland a communist regime was established in which, at least until 1956, the dominant position was held by the security apparatus, effectively under the control of the Soviet Union. Stalin, during the Second World War, had allowed considerable leeway to the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, which had gone significantly beyond the earlier form of Jewish socialist autonomy in stressing its links with world Jewry. One of its leaders, Itzik Pfeffer, who was also at this time informing the NKVD about the activities of other members of the committee, in his poem Ich bin a Yid, I am a Jew, gave a history of Jewish persecution and achievement from the pharaohs to the present, listing key Jewish figures, including Bar Kokhba, Samson, Rabbi Akiva, Isaiah, Solomon, Heine, Yehuda Halevi, Spinoza, Marx, Levitan, and Mendele. I point out there's only one socialist in this group. He expressed his solidarity with Jews all over the world. From Haifa harbor answering, from London comes the response to me, from Buenos Aires and New York come songs from Jews who fight and work, and even from the Berlin hell comes a shuddering I know well. In them all one word runs through, I am a Jew. All this was inflammatory stuff. And in the post-war situation, Stalin was convinced that in a war with the United States, the Jews would prove disloyal. His suspicion of them increased with the establishment of the State of Israel, and although he had originally supported its creation, partly to undermine British influence in the Middle East, and partly because he felt it would be pro-Soviet, he was now greatly alarmed both by the support for it among Soviet Jews and by its pro-Western political orientation. As a result, he began to purge Russified Jews from the Soviet political and cultural world and took brutal action against the principal figures in Soviet Yiddish culture, arresting and executing the leading writers in August 1952. His successors abandoned the most brutal aspects of his anti-Jewish policies, but Jews now felt themselves to be second-class citizens. And they were particularly offended by the brutal Soviet propaganda which accompanied the Six-Day War in the Middle East, and many of them now identified either with the growing dissident movement in the Soviet Union or sought to emigrate, principally to Israel. The history of Jews in Poland since 1944 was obviously deeply affected by these developments in the Soviet Union, and it's marked by a number of themes. The first was the failure to establish, at least until 1989, a viable Jewish community. The number of Jews diminished here in a series of waves of immigration, 1944, 47, 1956 to 58, 1967 to 69. The last of these, in which perhaps 15,000 Jews left the country, was the most traumatic, when the government itself unleashed a barely disguised anti-Semitic campaign. A second theme is the rapid acculturation and Polonization of those Jews who remained in Poland, some of whom came to play an important role in Polish cultural life, among them Stanisław Vygotsky, Julian Strykowski, Adolf Rudnicki, Bogdan Wojdowski, Henryk Grinberg, and Hanna Kral. Among these Polonized Jews, there were also those who played a major role in Polish political life. Adam Michnik is the most obvious example. A third theme is the debate over the role of communists of Jewish origin in establishing and consolidating the communist regime. At root, the presence of communists of Jewish origin in significant positions in the security apparatus has to be seen as a consequence of Stalin's deep distrust of the Poles. It took place at the same time as the purge of Yiddish cultural activists in the Soviet Union and the wider campaign against cosmopolitanism, which was essentially an attack on Russified Jews within this new Soviet intelligentsia. The retention of Jews in these positions in Poland was clearly intended by Stalin to be a temporary expedient until a larger group of reliable local communists could be trained. Indeed, the history of Polish communism until its collapse in 1989 can be seen as the unsuccessful attempt to create such a group. The last section of the book describes the attempts to recreate Jewish life in the area since the end of communism in 1989 to 1991. The enormous efforts which have been made both by local Jews and by international Jewish organizations are now beginning to bear fruit. But whether viable communities can be created, and whether what will remain will be caretaker communities, small groups of Jews attempting, with the help of sympathetic non-Jews, to preserve the physical remnants of Jewish life here, is still unclear. I gave a more optimistic spin on this last night, and that is the spin which we take at the museum, but one has also to express this doubt. Indeed, it's certainly difficult to see the caretaker communities of Lithuania and Belarus surviving beyond another generation. At the same time, the importance of these areas in the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe makes efforts to preserve the Jewish heritage here of high quality. The appalling nature of the fate of Jews in these countries during the Holocaust also demands that the tragedy shouldn't be forgotten and that an honest investigation of the role in it played by local populations be undertaken. I should add here I'm a member of the historical commission which the Lithuanian government set up to look into the two occupations. The same imperatives apply to Ukraine, although here it's possible to be more optimistic. Certainly the Maidan revolution has created a much more favorable relationship between Jews and Ukrainians, but at the same time the continued unrest in Ukraine stimulates immigration among Jews, many of whom have relations who've already immigrated and for whom the continued unrest is difficult. The situation in Russia is even more problematic, although there are more Jews there. Growth of chauvinism in Russia, in my view, is bound sooner or later to lead to much greater anti-Semitism, although one of the few things that can be said in the favor of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is that he is not clearly an anti-Semite. But anybody who reads what's in the comments at the bottom of the various print articles that you can see in the Russian press can see that the growth of chauvinism is reflected in anti-Semitism and in the belief that the US is dominated by anti-Russian Jews. The situation in Poland, I think, does give rise for more optimism. And certainly the attempts of all those involved in the recreation of Jewish life in Poland have been little short of Herculean. And yet, as I already mentioned, a note of caution should be added. It may be possible for a Jewish community as small as that in Poland, even with all those people who are connected in some way with Jewish life. There are no more than 30,000 Jews in Poland. It may be possible for such a community to survive on the basis of pride in its past, which is reflected in the museum, rather than upon the existence of a critical mass of Jews prepared to commit themselves to sustaining collective Jewish existence. But it remains an open question whether a self-sustaining and significant cultural centre can develop here, even if on a much smaller scale than in its heyday. It's often proved difficult for Jews whose grandparents and great-grandparents, now great-great-grandparents, I'm always struck by, I'm about to retire from teaching in August, but this is the situation with my students as with everybody else's, who left Eastern Europe at the end of the late 19th and early 20th centuries to find a common language with the more recent immigrants or with the Jews still living there. One major difference between them is the importance they attach to the religious aspect of their Jewish identity. According to the 1990 National Jewish Population Survey, 47% of American Jews believe that Jews are a religious group, and that figure is higher in the more recent surveys, up to 51%. Similarly, the Gutmann Institute report of 1996 on the religious beliefs of Jews in Israel found that only 21% were totally non-observant, and that figure fell to 17% when the Gutmann Institute again examined this issue last year. By contrast, surveys carried out in Russia 1992 and 93, Ukraine 1997 and 8, and in Poland show that only a very small percentage, less than 5% of Jews polled, defined being a Jew as practicing Judaism. The basis for their Jewish identity is ethnic. 2/3 of the Russian respondents say that to feel oneself part of the Jewish people is the essence of Jewishness, a view shared by most Ukrainian Jews surveyed and also by most Polish Jews surveyed. The Jews remaining in Eastern Europe have feelings for their countries of birth which are much more nuanced and complex than their American and Israeli fellow Jews often understand. Polish Jewish and Russian Jewish writing since the end of Soviet communism often expresses frustration that Israelis and American Jews fail to understand or empathize with their experiences and with their particular understanding of their Jewish identity. In her story, Tylko Króciutko, briefly now, the Polish Jewish writer Hanna Kral describes a group of Polish Jewish women survivors visiting New York in the 1980s. The American Jews they encounter persistently ask them why they are returning to a country of cemeteries, to a Jewish cemetery. They mean Jewish graves, because in their eyes, Poland today is solely a Jewish cemetery. In fact, these women are also returning to Polish graves, since they have survived the war as children adopted by Christian families or have assimilated through mixed marriages. Some of them have two mothers in both a literal and a symbolic sense. The only person who understands their feelings is an American rabbi who's been escorting them through their trip. And this is how the story ends. The rabbi drove them to the airport. Unlike the others, he didn't ask any questions. He still did not smell of cheap tobacco, home-baked pastry, and tefillin, like the rabbis of their childhood. But at least he no longer asked any questions. Now, this is not a new problem in Jewish life, and it's one that can be overcome. In his diary entry of 21 May 1942, Abraham Levin described the resettlement in the Warsaw Ghetto of Jews from German-speaking Europe. For the time being, he wrote, no contact has established itself between us and them. Between us and them, there lies a wall of hundreds of years of prejudice and linguistic division. Yet we are like two brothers, one of whom fate has dispatched to some far-off place, to America, while the second remains in his Polish or Lithuanian shtetl. When the two meet, after 15 or 20 years, there's a feeling of estrangement. But in the course of time, the sense of brotherhood conquers all feelings of alienation. Now, the complex story of the Jews of Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and of their contribution to Jewish life and to the culture of the larger world around them, needs to be better known and better understood in the diaspora, in Israel, and in the countries of Eastern Europe. The Nazi attempts to annihilate the Jews and Stalin's efforts to eradicate their culture ultimately failed. There are still Jews in Eastern Europe, and the rich culture the Jews created there remains a source of admiration and inspiration to both non-Jews and Jews. And it's my hope that the book which I've written, and also the museum which has now been established in Warsaw, will contribute to the preservation and informed appreciation of the Jews of this region. Let me conclude with two epigraphs which I used as two quotations which I used as epigraphs in Volume 3. The first is from a poem by Uri Tzvi Grinberg, a Hebrew poet of very right-wing predilections, but who's actually also a great poet like W.B. Yeats. This is a poem called Under Duress. We were forced to hate what we loved. We loved forest and brook, well and mill, falling leaves, fish, well bucket, challah. Secretly even loved the sound of their church bells, even the bleach-haired young girls. We loved the harmonica and flute, Ukrainian songs, village girls dancing in colorful rings, thatched cottages painted white with red rafters, winter's end dripping from their roofs. We were forced to leave great cities where we loved to smoke in cafes. Opera, evening dress, perfumed hair, dance halls, opium, ballet, boulevards, whorehouses. Wrenched from the shtetls, we saw our houses in fire-filled tears, knowing they would burn in the end. And the second is from Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago. Unlike many Russian critics, I think that this is probably his greatest achievement, even greater than his wonderful poetry. And this is what he put in the mouth of one of his characters. Reshaping life. This is the idea of people who, whatever they have seen, have never known the essence of life, or felt its spirit and its soul. For them, life is a lump of crude material in need of shaping and reshaping, and untouched by their noble hands. But life is never simply material, a substance. If you would like to know, it is constantly renewing, transforming, remaking, and transfiguring itself. Life is beyond your and my obtuse theories about it.